How do we create money in society? Private banks are creating money by giving a loan. When do you give a loan? When you think you can make a return on it. So the incentive for money creation is profit. If you talk about degrowth and you say, hey, I want to have an economy within planetary boundaries, you have to discuss money creation. And you have to make sure that what is happening there has some kind of link with the real economy.
Hans, thank you so much for joining us in the breakdown today.
Thanks for having me.
I think you're a very interesting figure, and we're going to get into why. But we're talking today mostly about the idea of degrowth and post-growth economics. And, that tends to be ideas and words that are thrown around in more radical kind of activist circles, sort of the climate justice space. And I think many people will be surprised to hear it being advocated for by someone like yourself who works in the financial sector. So if you wouldn't mind, could you just start by sort of introducing yourself and walking us through a bit of your journey to becoming a kind of post-growth economist?
Yeah. It took some time, to be honest. It maybe 2 decades. I started, my first job was at a labor union. So I always wanted to change the world. But then I experienced that unions are kind of conservative. So they more or less advocate only for the insiders. And when I was 25, that didn't feel good. So I went to a government agency, worked a lot with economic modeling. So macroeconomic modeling, I really like that stuff. Didn't question the assumptions so much, just did the work, what it was taught also at university as being an economist. And then I think around the financial crisis, then I started also working at a Dutch bank, Rabobank, as an economist. Later became chief economist. But then I thought, yeah, maybe this is not that relevant sometimes, what we do. So forecasting the quarterly GDP figures and then with 5 people guessing what it will be. Or interest rates forecast, etc. So very nitty-gritty stuff. And what was happening to me, I had to give a lot of presentations to clients, private banking clients, wealthy people. And I had a story, this is the biggest crisis since the 1930s, so this is very bad. And all those people were looking at me, okay, can you tell something about what will happen to the markets and my savings? And so there was a complete disconnect. That was the first one. The second one was a few years later when I started working on scenarios, on longer-term scenarios. And then, to be honest, for the first time, I was really digging into the ecological side of everything. I said, yeah, but I missed this completely in also the economic modeling I was working on and everything I did. So then, year after year, reading a lot. Then I went to Triodos Bank. And I think also 10 years ago, I gave an interview and I said, degrowth is impossible because an economy has to grow. And I ended up being here saying, there is only one possibility to have an economy within planetary boundaries, and that is to think about radical change, and one of that is degrowth.
So for the benefit of everyone, could you just define for us what you mean by degrowth and a term that also you use in your work a lot, which is post-growth,
Yep.
And if those two differ at all and how you understand them?
Yeah, maybe it's good to start with degrowth in the sense that we wanted to have it happen. So a planned reduction of resource use, of energy use, to have a sustainable system. That's different than saying degrowth is less economic growth. That can be a consequence, but the intention is to have an economy within planetary boundaries, to use less resource use. Coupled on the degrowth narrative is, of course, the discussion on equity, social inclusion, etc. So we also want to do it in such a way that it is inclusive, that everyone can benefit. So degrowth is the realization that we have to do less, given where we are now. Post-growth is being there.
Okay.
To be very simple, but you can also say, okay, post-growth, and that's most of the time. Well, why I use the word post-growth and not always degrowth, because in some circles, I use the word degrowth because then I want to address the growth imperative. I'll come back to that later, what that is. In other circles, I just want to say, hey, we have an agenda, a post-growth agenda, an agenda not depending on economic growth. Why is this essential to also play around with words? Because if I talk to my fellow economists, I talk about degrowth, then I want to be offensive. Then I want to discuss because they understand that we have a system that is dependent upon economic growth. So then I want to discuss with them, hey, we have created a system, an economic system, that can only survive if it grows. Which is very strange for a system that it can only survive as it grows. Because if we don't have economic growth, we see unemployment rising, we see government budgets having problems, we see companies going bankrupt. So we have all kinds of problems in the economic system if it does not grow. Then people say, economists or other policymakers also say, hey, yeah, because this is the fact. That's why degrowth is impossible. But that's a within system reasoning, because if you build a system dependent on growth, yeah, of course, it needs to grow.
It's dependent on growth.
It's dependent on growth. But you can also say, hey, this system is what we have created, so the institutional structure of the system is also something you can change. And then you come with the post-growth and degrowth agenda, and you say, hey, but maybe if we change the profit incentives in the system, if we change the revenues of the government, for instance, they are now also dependent on growth. So you can change a lot of things in the system that it becomes less growth dependent. And then you can say, hey, maybe we have a different post-growth system that is within planetary boundaries. So this is more or less the agenda you want to push, that I want to push a little bit.
And can you talk a bit about why, I mean, you touched on it there, but why we sort of need degrowth in general? Because, you know, one thing we hear a lot in the UK is, you know, oh, look at how well the UK has decoupled, is the word, its carbon emissions from GDP growth, meaning that as our GDP continues to rise, we're sort of emitting less in relative terms. And so wouldn't that kind of obviate the need for degrowth if that could be replicated in other places?
Yeah, this is the very strong narrative. I think it's more a coping mechanism. It's something we don't want to see. And it is true, right? So that we see absolute decoupling in rich countries like the UK, but also in Europe. Last week there was also a press release from the European Commission saying 8.2% decline in carbon emissions, while the European Union had some growth, not that much. So again, evidence was also last week, I think, a research paper that in 1,500 regions they research if there is absolute decoupling, so economic growth goes up and carbon emissions go down, if that was possible over a longer period, and in 30% of the cases it was. So there is evidence that we can have absolute decoupling. However, one, it is not going fast enough to reach the targets of the Paris Agreement.
Which we've already sort of blown by.
Yeah, but whatever, to be on track for something that leads to net zero sometime. And the second one is that it is only about carbon emissions.
Yeah.
Because sustainability is not only about carbon. And if you look, for instance, to resource use, there was also a report this year from the United Nations on resource use, and it was called Bend the Curve, and then they very proudly, if you looked at the report, you would say, this is great stuff. In the report, they made a scenario where they used a lot of degrowth kind of ideas. So sufficiency, also less smaller houses or less living space, so really sufficiency kind of measures, but then still resource use would in 2060 be 20% higher than it is today. And there was one crucial assumption that did not change, and that was economic growth. And we know resource use has to decrease because resource use leads to pollution, leads to land use change, leads to all the things that leads to biodiversity loss, which is kind of threatening us, well, more or less. And we don't want to talk about it because there's completely clear that there is no possibility to decouple, in an absolute sense, biodiversity loss or resource use from economic growth. So if you broaden a little bit your agenda, then you see that green growth is almost impossible. There's another argument. Innovation can do a lot of stuff and can really make sure that we are more effective in the use of resources, that we use less energy. But then we have the fabulous rebound effect, which more or less means that every time we have innovation that leads to energy savings or resource savings and the price goes down, what are we going to do if the price goes down or something? We use more. We see it in cars. We have seen it in the 1900s already. The Jevons paradox, that was the first one who kind of invented it with coal. We see it time and time again. So that means that even when we invented the needed technology, it will not lead to the savings we need. And this kind of paradox, together with the fact that it's almost impossible, leads to only one conclusion. We have to think about all the economic activity we have. And that means we need to have less, especially, and that's also a degrowth agenda is for me especially an agenda for the richest countries in the world, because also people in the global south are going to say, yeah, hey, what are you talking? But we need economic growth for development, which is kind of right, but we need the right economic growth, because we see also in poorer countries a lot of increasing economic activity that only benefits a few. So also there we can question if only talking about economic growth helps all the people living there.
And one of the sort of criticisms often leveraged against degrowth, and we've touched on it a little bit there, is this idea that it is kind of like austerity ecology, right? So you're looking at just kind of demanding more subsistence lifestyles and that everyone sort of consume less, particularly in rich countries, when, you know, a lot of people living even within the wealthiest countries in the world are really struggling to get by, have suffered quite significantly under, you know, a post-financial crisis era of relatively slow, low growth. So what, you know, does degrowth look like practically in a way that doesn't mean sort of less for people who are already struggling, whether that's in, you know, the global south, but also within a country like the UK or the Netherlands or the US?
Yeah. Well, you can only successfully, and that's where it starts. So you can say this is the end point. We need an economy with less economic activity. We also know that there is already enough for everyone on this planet in terms of food, in terms of energy use. If you redistribute it in a different way, there's more than enough. So the agenda is always also about redistribution. But if you want to make it very practical, and also politically feasible, which is also kind of a challenge. You can also start, and that's what I sometimes think, you should start very, very small and simple with some measures you can take. It's about ownership structures, which has also incorporation structures. So who's the owner of a company? What are the incentives lying behind it? But also pension systems, so financial structures, which in the end incentivize growth imperatives. So they make it necessary that everything in the economy is only driven by profit and growth. And if we start there, so you don't start about redistribution immediately. You start with the structures that a lot of people even don't know. And if you start there, you hopefully get a different distribution, which this sounds very abstract. But to make it more concrete, pension funds put all the money on financial markets via BlackRock, etc. Because they need a return. So they give a mandate and say, we need 8% return annually because, hey, we have to pay the pensions when our the people that give us the money are retired. So this is a way to do it via the financial markets. So this gives a profit of a growth incentive into the system, because then the shareholders of those companies say, hey, because these are the asset managers, say, hey, you need to make an 8% return, so they need to make a lot of profit, so that leads to a growth imperative in the system. But if you would say, hey, we have this money, what do you need when you're old? You need housing, you need healthcare. Okay, let's make sure that we have good housing for all the people. Let's have healthcare. Why should we do it via the financial markets? Then you get rid of one growth imperative. Then you say, okay, this is just building houses and hospitals, etc., and longer-term care. Then you have a different economy. What also happens then, that instead of having those asset managers being owner of social housing and asking rents to increase, you have a different owner of those houses, you have different rent structures, so then you get also this redistribution of the benefit and the cost. And this is another way than saying, hey, we need to have higher taxes for people with high incomes. I think that should also be done. But so working on this kind of structures is, I think, in the end, politically easier to get through than starting let's talk about wealth taxes, inheritance taxes, income taxes, especially at this time.
Yeah, pensions are so interesting to me. I mean, in the UK, they're so abysmal in terms of the pension coverage that most people have. And as you point out, it's always just been so wild to me that we have, asset managers who own, care homes, and they're like juicing returns from the care homes with detrimental effects on people with pensions so that they can pay into those people's. It's just wild that we sort of orchestrated things that way. So I want to touch a little bit more on finance and sort of structure the financial system. It's hard for me to imagine what or post-growth looks like for a bank. Yeah. So speaking from the perspective of the industry you work in, what does degrowth look like for finance? And maybe as part of that, you could just give us a very brief 101 on like what it is that banks actually really do.
Oh, that's a small question.
Just a tiny. Just
what are banks doing?
Finance to us.
Explain finance and degrowth in one. I think. And that's also why I started with the structures behind what is in politics. Because the question you always get if you talk about degrowth, hey, this is impossible. Because it's infeasible, because politicians will never introduce degrowth policies because it's not attractive for their voters. I agree with that, but it's also short-sighted, blah, 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 and everything, but that's politics. If you bring it to finance, then you see also some growth imperatives in finance that you can reduce. And I always talk about 3 levels that we have there, and I also touch upon what's the financial sector actually doing. So we have the institutional setup of the financial system itself. So this is central banks, money creation, that kind of stuff, and how we do that. I'm not going into details, but let's also only take money creation. And the relationship between money creation and planetary boundaries. How do we create money in society? Private banks are creating money by giving a loan. When do you give a loan? When you think you can make a return on it as a bank. So the incentive for profit for money creation is profit. Mm-hmm. This is a growth incentive, it's a growth imperative already. It's not related to what that money, that loan, is doing in the real economy. So the economy from physical stuff. So related to nature, to the real world, to ecosystem. There's completely no relation. So money creation is not related to whatever. Only what we know that if we create money, and we can create money, then there is economic activity, because part of the money that is created is only running around in the financial sector. In the end, all that money that is created ends up in there, so that's also debt. And the debt is a claim on our natural world in the end. So if you talk about degrowth and you say, hey, I want to have an economy within planetary boundaries, you have to discuss money creation. And you have to make sure that what is happening there has some kind of link with the real economy. There are ways to do it. It's just saying, hey, money creation should not be about profit, but hey, let's start what it does in the real economy. Can we not have credit guidance on some form of idea from central banks to say, okay, you can only create money if you understand what's happening in the real economy? This is very vague for a lot of people, but it is essential if you want to have a financial system that works within planetary boundaries. This is the first part. So this is the financial system. So you need to think about the rules of the system. There's also something about interest rates and how you do it. But the second part is the financial institutions themselves. What a bank is doing is saying, okay, I give a loan, I see what kind of risk it is, so the risk-adjusted return is what I need to have depending on my ownership structure. I need to make some kind of profits for it. You can also do it differently. That's what we try to do at Triodos Bank. We want to make impact. We want to finance change, as we call it. So we really want to understand what that money does in the real economy. And we also changed it a little bit over the last few years, not only saying it should be sustainable, no, it should also help a transition, which is quite ambitious, also to understand it already. But if you do that, then you can say, okay, but so I would claim that what Triodos Bank is doing is already kind of post-growth, because we only finance those parts of the economy that we think contributes to well-being of people, and we exclude a lot of things that are completely unnecessary. So that's the degrowth part. So we don't do fossil fuels, we don't do fast fashion, we don't do mainstream banks that only make money from money, so we do a lot of things not. So our role is to do only that part that needs to grow in that, and that's why I prefer to call it post-growth for us, because we do the part that needs to flourish. And then that's also part that people kind of miss. They think degrowth is that everything should shrink, but there's a difference between that parts that needs to blossom, that needs to grow, and the other parts that needs to shrink. And the material footprint of that part is larger than the parts that needs to grow. So that's on the financial sector, and there are a lot of things about the structure and the concentration ratios and asset managers that also needs to be different to be in line with post-growth. But in the end, it is also the ownership structure or the mandates that are given that determine the growth imperatives. People always say, yeah, but in a degrowth world, you cannot have interest rates. I think that's not the case. You can have, on two conditions, it's possible to have interest rates. One is, if the loan that is given creates value that people like in the real economy, and that they pay for it, and that the interest that is paid to the bank is again used in the real economy. If it's accumulated, then you have a problem. So you need those two conditions to have interest in a post-growth economy. The third layer of all of this, so is also that in the real economy you need to have those activities that belong to that post-growth world, that can be financed in the post-growth world. We, as Triodos Bank, had a problem for a lot of years that we had more savings than we could lend out to things that were really contributing to a sustainable economy. And that's also a challenge. And then you need also governments to come in, you need new rules to make it also feasible to have also profitable economic activities. And there's a whole strand of literature also in degrowth that people say you cannot have private ownership in a degrowth economy. That's the more radical version, which I can also see. But if you want to make a transition, it's not so helpful to start about a socialist, communist economy.
But why?
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, I do want to pick up on that point a little bit about sort of private ownership and the kinds of actors that we're talking about, because Triodos is quite an exception, you might say, within the industry. And do you think that what you do is, replicable in any way, or, can we rely on sort of well-intentioned market actors to try and bring this about, or, who do you see as the kind of agent of this change? Because I'm not sure I trust that many people in finance to be on board with, what you're talking about.
I agree. I'm sure that we as Triodos Bank do at least what we say we do. So I think we really do the best we can. And I like to be in that place because it's also difficult because you are part of the financial system which is in the end extractive, as what everybody is doing. And also if you see regulations, for example, part of the regulation on financial stability is more or less saying to banks, you need to have 8 to 12% return on equity. Okay, that means that you put a growth imperative into the financial system as a way of saying this is financial stability. The whole world of sustainable finance, that's completely profit-driven. Has nothing to do with post-growth or degrowth, and you can even question if it's sustainable in the end. Also, I'm doubting more and more in Europe all that regulation that has come out. I think it did not help to move any sense to more sustainability. It's kind of a distraction, and this is sometimes also difficult to say because we favor, as Triodos Bank, more regulation, but the right regulation. And I think they all started at a different point, and that's what you still see. So they started at what is green and greenwashing and defining it and disclosing it, while I think it was more important to start at the brown part and say, hey, this is really very bad. Let's disclose it. And then also set regulation, stricter regulation on not doing things that are not right. So I don't trust the financial system and the sector as it is to deliver on anything.
And this is a slightly side point, but what is it like when you as part of your job, walk into a room, maybe you're giving a lecture, maybe you're doing a podcast with other finance people? What is the kind of reception of these ideas? Do they look at you like you're crazy, or are people more on board than we might think? At least in the abstract.
What they think, I don't know. There is an advantage of being in the financial sector, because I think I know how it works. I think I know how it works. Maybe I get it wrong, but so that gives you more credibility also to other people in the financial sector. So I worked also at Triodos Bank for a time at our asset manager. So I know what equity or bond analysts actually are doing every day. And I work at a bank, so I know the different parts of the financial system because I've been there and I see what people are doing there. So that, and also we as Triodos Bank need to implement all this regulation every day, and that helps if you really understand what's going on. Then you're a more credible partner to discuss with, and if I have conversations with my colleagues. They most of the time say, yeah, that's what you can do, but we cannot do it. So it's not that they say that I'm a complete lunatic. Maybe they think I am, but they don't say it. But I think there's, but you're niche and you can do it. I had yesterday some conversations with the Dutch mainstream biggest banks, and so there's a lot of respect, I would say, for our positioning and that we can do it. But they always say, but you can do it. We cannot.
We couldn't. Yeah.
We couldn't, and I understand, of course, because they have on their balance sheets a huge legacy of degrowth, and they don't want to see it.
Yeah. So I want to ask you, I guess, how this looks at the international level, because, as you talked about, one of the things that needs to happen is that, wealthier countries need to slow down, maybe degrow, but that sort of definitely from where we stand today can't really be the prospect for, some of the lowest income countries around the world. And yet we have a kind of global financial architecture that, penalizes effectively, maybe that's the wrong word, but lending to higher risk economies, right? So you pay a higher rate of interest, higher returns are demanded for what's considered, riskier investments in, say, an energy plant in, Nigeria. And that seems to kind of directly counteract what actually needs to be happening. So what does change look like in terms of how we do international finance in a way that would actually address some of the goals that you're laying out?
The risks in the difference between emerging markets and advanced economy is mostly institutional, so country-specific risks which are related to governance structures itself. They're not relating to how much economic growth there is, but how stable it is and how predictable it is. I see there, in a very optimistic mood, also possibilities to to use the kind of degrowth agenda, which is about basic needs, about stabilizing, about resilience of an economy, which is more important than growth, to use it also in emerging markets and saying, hey, this is not the specific IMF World Bank growth agenda, but we can do an agenda that really supports people and in the end also the planet to do things in a better way. And that, I think, will be very attractive for investors to say, hey, but this is stable, so the risks are lower if you have better institutions. So this is very optimistic, but in reality it will not go. But it would help if international organizations like the IMF and World Bank use a little bit more of that agenda instead of the neoliberal agenda that they have always pursued. I think then the risk really can go down, and so investing can become more attractive. As Triodos Bank, we have already for a long time microfinance funds which kind of work in that way. So try to understand the people, understand where you finance, and then you get a stable return most of the time. So this is the very optimistic part of this agenda. There's also so what could work? No, there are two things. At this moment, and also for the coming years, it will be very hard to come to any international agreements on anything. So what you can do then is at least form a club of countries sometimes who execute different kind of policies. Either on climate and biodiversity, but also on how do you handle growth and growth imperatives and what country do you want to be. That will be hard, given the polarization and the fragmentation of international organizations, but I think that's the only way out, to kind of try to have front-running countries to do different kind of stuff, then also in the financial sector. And I don't know what will happen also to the financial sector from a global perspective, given also the dominance of the dollar. I think the coming years will be decisive if the US can remain the center of finance, or that it will be not replaced, but it will be fragmented all over the world. And that can have already severe consequences on how whatever agenda, call it post-growth, will be effective in a global financial system.
I guess one thing that I find interesting about having read your work, which I haven't read all of it, admittedly, but you publish a lot. It seems like what you advocate for is a sort of radically reformed capitalism. But it also seems to me that I can't imagine how capitalism would function without growth for all the reasons we've talked about a bit, right? It kind of relies on returns, and particularly capitalist democracies, I guess, that kind of very unholy union that relies on growth kind of as a social contract, such that, you know, the huge inequalities we see are made tolerable by this kind of promise of growth. You know, how do you reconcile those two things?
No, you're right. I don't have, I think, discovered the complete idea of what would in the end be feasible. But I think at this point in time, so we talked about the ecological impossibility of having more growth, but there's also a real impossibility of even having growth itself in a lot of the Western world. I think especially in Europe, we need growth like 2% on average, real economic growth, and we don't get it. Because we have demographics, so we have aging, that's one part, but we also have productivity growth, which is really lacking. So and economic growth in the long run is nothing else than more people going to work and do it smarter. So the smart part is productivity, more people is just having no aging, but for instance, immigration, which is kind of impossible. So then you have a system that depends on growth that is not there. There's also a reason why productivity growth is lacking. And I think that has for a lot to do with the complexity of our society, that the smartest people are no longer working on inventing new stuff, but trying to hold everything together. So we have made it so, and that's also what you see in the past. The more complex a society becomes, it kind of reaches a point where it stabilizes and then it can collapse. And we are not used to thinking in that way about an economy because we expect linear growth, so 3%, 2% a year. And there's enough evidence that growth is also non-linear, like in every system, and that in the end you reach a point of saturation and then it might go down. So this is maybe the more urgent and less political reason why we have to think about getting rid of some of those growth imperatives. Is it then possible to have a reformed version of capitalism that still works? I don't know. And that's also part of what I'm thinking. So ownership structures, so private ownership is essential in capitalism. So we have to think for a part private ownership. Together with that, we have to rethink what's the role of the market, what's the role of the government, and what's the role of us, commons, etc., and how will that work? Is that still capitalism? Maybe it's a different form of capitalism, less capitalism. And that is possible, I think, but not without any shocks. And it might take a long time. But there is something there. So I don't have the final idea. So I'm more worried about how do we make first steps? How do we improve a little bit than saying this is the end version of it. And I think at this point in time saying, yeah, we have to get rid of capitalism is not productive because then we don't have a conversation with anyone.
Starting from the end point, I guess. Or
yeah.
And just to pick up on something that you said there, which is, what for you are those first steps? We've talked a little bit about, pension systems, but when you go out every day and work on this, what are you seeing as the kind of strategic sequence to get us to what is quite a radically different endpoint?
Yeah, it's a good question.
I'm sure it's constantly evolving, but...
Yeah, it's constantly evolving and also depends on who are you talking with. In terms of transitions, there are always three things we need to do. So on the one hand, we need to build what is already possible. So the grassroots movement, the alternative, the postgrowth movement, a postgrowth bank, that kind of stuff, to show that there is an alternative that works. The second part is criticize the system. Yeah. For some people, it is relevant to explain that we live in our own narrative that we also can change, because we didn't touch upon it. People think that economic growth is like a natural law.
Sure, yeah.
It is not. It is an invention, it's a narrative, it's our own story of our own time, and we can change it. So to explain that, explain the problems, explain why green growth is not a solution is also essential to do. The third thing we always have to do is to show the vision where we can go and how it can play out. And those three things, so showing the new alternative, what is possible, criticizing, and the vision, we all need to do on different parts to get things moving. And there's always a danger if you criticize too much and have a vision that are too far apart, that other people with different vision support your criticism, but you end up in a completely different society. And that's where I'm sometimes afraid of, that people say, yeah, we have a lot of trouble, a lot of problems, but the solution is completely different. And I think that's where we are now, when we have a moment of real tension in many societies, polarization, which comes from the progressive idea we need to have a better vision, a better society, completely different, but better. And we have people who say, yes, we agree, this is not good, we go back to what it was before, and we promise you that we can do it. We've seen many countries where that happens. And it starts with the same kind of criticism, and it addresses the same kind of fear from people. So they feel, because I think, and that's also what you see in a lot of literature and research, people are afraid in the Western world. So they're afraid of what's happening, so they're anxious, and then the logical reaction is to say, hey, but I want to go back how it was. And that's not possible. And only if we can have that story, so again, showing, telling, criticizing, and convincing more people that the alternative that we foresee, and you can call it post-growth or radical change, but something that can work within ecological boundaries before it's all collapsed, that's what we have to do. Is that easy? No. Am I optimistic? No. Is it the only thing we should do? Yes. And is that an academic agenda? No, this is almost a political agenda. I never want to go into politics because I will never be effective there. But this is what we need to do to get things moving and to have some, in the end, a positive, progressive agenda to to a world that can work. This is getting very political. I'm never so political, but.
This is a safe space.
No, but it is essential to understand that this is part of the work I've been doing for the last few years, or maybe also my own history as being an economist. That also you are taught that these are kind of natural laws. This is how the economy is, but the economy never is. The economy is what we do. And that difference is so important, and it is also normative and subjective. All those things you learn in economics or what we do in finance are all made up by us. And this is disappointing sometimes if you find out. But it's also the most powerful idea that we have. That, hey, if this is all made up and it's not working, let's invent something that works better. And we just can do it. It's not like gravity. It's just what we can. And this idea that gives me hope that you can just change the rules of the game, and then we play a different game. Only if people believe in that game, and because that's what we have to do. Let people believe in a new game.
Well, I think that is the perfect place to leave it. Actually, thank you for summarizing all of that, and thank you for joining us on the breakdown.
Thank you for having me.